Cleveland's own News Center 8.
Good evening. Robin is off tonight. I'm Denise Dufala.
Thanks for joining us. Here's what's happening. 13 seconds of gunfire that seemed like an eternity. 20 years ago today at Kent State University. The Kent State shootings, 4 dead, 9 wounded. An event that stunned the world and changed America. Today on May 4th, 1990, 20 years to the day after the tragic event, those involved have come together in Kent in memory of May 4th to dedicate a lasting memorial to the events of that day, one that calls on all of us to learn from them.
And joining us live now from the site of the newly dedicated May 4th Memorial on the Kent State campus is News Center 8's Dick Russ.
A torrential rain has been falling here in Kent for about the last hour, and that has kept the number of people who are stopping at the newly dedicated memorial in the latter hours of this afternoon to a minimum. Those who have stopped by, though, are doing what people did this morning at the dedication ceremony, stopping to inquire, to learn, and to reflect about the events that happened here 20 years ago today. News Center 8's Bill McKay reports on this morning's dedication and a call for peace and healing in place of bitterness and hate.
Yes, it was a different place when I walked this campus 20 years ago. Today, thousands are remembering in memorial the event of May 4th, 1970. Then, it was a place of confrontation, outsiders inciting hatred and revolution, the Vietnam War, and confusion and frustration over that war. This day began with the final hours of the vigil at the sites where the 4 students were shot. Today's students held readings reflecting the thoughts of the students on campus 20 years ago. And like it was after the shooting 20 years ago, the news media today descended in a number of over 100. At an early news conference, Mrs. Florence Schroeder, mother of Bill, one of the students who died, explained for reporters why, after 11 years of silence, she was making a public appearance.
Today we're doing what we call our last appearance. We feel that 20 years, it has not just been 20 years since the killings, but we are 20 years older. And we feel that it's time for younger people to take over and continue the vigilance to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Mrs. Schroeder would add that her son did not die in vain, but she felt the deaths brought closer the time for the end of the war. Today's memorial and dedication, said KSU President Dr. Michael Schwartz, was a time for all to come together.
For all of us to remember. And then, having remembered, we must now move on, knowing that we have grieved, that we have learned, and that we continue to learn, and that the hallmark now of Kent State University is inquiry, learning, and reflection, in hope that we will have the clearest of all views of the past, in order that those clear views may serve the future, which is to say, our students.
Present for the dedication service were Governor Richard Celeste, who said the day should serve as a source of learning rather than a focus of bitterness. Dean Kaler, who was paralyzed, says he has forgiven the guardsmen who wounded him, noting that healing is something that comes from within. And Dr. Jerry Lewis, co-chair of today's event, and a man I first met 20 years ago.
The tragedy of 4 dead in Ohio and 9 wounded causes spiritual and emotional wounds all over the world. The annual vigil serves the ideas of inquire, learn, and reflect.
Throughout the day, the rain would continue, and the crowd huddled from one place to another. Many here were just babies when in 13 seconds 4 students died and 9 others were wounded 20 years ago. The memorial site, it is hoped, will encourage people to ask, What differences were confronting this university and nation at that time? I'm Bill McKay, News Center 8, on the campus of Kent State University 20 years later.
For those of us who made our homes as students in Kent in the months and years immediately following the events of May 4th, 1970, have also had a chance to pause and reflect upon the memorial here. And this day, May 4th, 1990, it seems to be the opinion of most that this is indeed a fitting memorial to the events of 20 years ago today. Tim?
All right, thank you, Dick. For those of us who covered the Kent State tragedy on that warm spring day, the passage of 20 years has done little to bring new perspective to the final legacy of the most violent decade in American history. Being there did not give us some kind of unique insight into how the unthinkable could happen. The best we can do is recall, reflect, and learn from one of America's darkest hours. News Center 8's Don Olson looks back at what led to those 13 out-of-control seconds in which the festering fury of Vietnam exploded in Middle America.
Night riders and the vigilantes are the worst type of people that we harbor in America.
But is that any reason to shoot and kill people because they're throwing stones or they're chanting like that?
Could I have done something different? Could I have stopped it?
When troops from the Ohio National Guard opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others, many historians consider it the beginning of the end of not only the Nixon administration, but the war in Vietnam. And it happened on the most mundane place in American society, a parking lot at a generally unknown Midwestern campus, Kent State. Dean Kaler's spine was shattered by a bullet that early afternoon. He is the most seriously injured of the wounded students.
I think of, obviously, the 4 students who were shot at Kent, Allison and Sandra and Jeffrey and Bill. Then the second thing that I think of that comes to my mind is the injustice and the travesty of power and the abuse of power that our elected officials exerted that day and the weeks preceding the shootings at Kent.
Dr. Jerry M. Lewis, a sociology professor, not only witnessed the shootings, but was nearly shot himself.
Kent State is about the use of force in a democracy, and that's what it's about. We need to inquire, learn, and reflect about how the kind of force that is used, how it's used, the consequences of that force.
The National Guard had been called in 3 days earlier to aid local authorities in coping with anti-war demonstrations in the wake of America's invasion of Cambodia. The ROTC building was burned to the ground on the evening of May 2nd.
Leave this area immediately.
With orders to disperse any student gathering, the Guard, with fixed bayonets and loaded rifles, began moving across the Commons area, firing tear gas canisters along the way. At 12:24 p.m., 28 guardsmen fired 61 shots. 4 students, Allison Krause, William Schroeder, Sandra Schroyer, and Jeffrey Miller, lay dying in a parking lot.
There's people dying down there. Get ambulance up here.
And in a time span of 13 seconds, a controversy was born that continues to burn 20 years later.
I could see 3 kids laying in the driveway down there with blood, and their girlfriends were standing over and crying and everything.
Brigadier General Robert Canterbury was the Guard's ranking officer.
Our people felt that their lives were in danger, which in fact was the case.
I don't think they did anything in my mind that I've ever seen that was wrong.
Colonel Charles Fassinger was in command of the troops that fired. He says to this day the Guardsmen feel repercussions from May 4th. Years of litigation and what was written in the media tore many families apart. Many of the Guardsmen were looking down the barrel of a gun at students not much younger than themselves.
There were certainly 4 families affected, but there were lots of other families affected. There were 100 and some Guard families affected. The school was affected. You know, the state, the nation, everybody was affected by what happened.
The students also continue to feel the effects of May 4th. They were characterized as unpatriotic hippies who deserved everything they got.
I was nothing more than a troublemaker, and that other students were as well, and that we weren't being very respectful of our government.
As for the university, enrollment declined over the years as the school suffered an image problem. To some Kent students who were just toddlers when the shootings occurred, May 4th was something to forget.
You know, we've got a lot more going for us than May 4th, 1970. And plus, you know, how many people are here from 15 years ago?
Controversy returned to campus in 1977. Demonstrators erected a tent city protesting the university's decision to construct a gym near the site of the shootings. After efforts to move the gym failed, protesters tore down fences and marched on the construction site. In July, 192 were arrested for defying a court order to disperse. Who is to blame for the events of May 4th? Was it Governor Jim Rhodes, who vowed to keep the university open at any cost, and who many thought laid the groundwork for violence with inflammatory remarks at a news conference on May 3rd?
These people just move from one campus to the other and terrorize the community. They're worse than the brown shirt and the communist element, and also the night riders and the vigilantes. They're the worst type of people that we harbor in America.
Was it General Canterbury who ordered his troops to break up what some people called a peaceful rally? Or the students who failed to disperse despite repeated warnings by the authorities? Or was it the unrest created by a restless society growing more and more frustrated over a war that seemed as though it would never end?
I don't think students know much about
Kaler,
that.
who now ironically is a member of the establishment himself, a commissioner in Athens County, says at first he was bitter, but now feels nothing but forgiveness for whomever pulled the trigger, paralyzing him for life.
If I harbored that bitterness and anger, I'd probably be very unproductive and very unuseful human being in society, and I didn't want to do that.
Colonel Fassinger, now a businessman in Cleveland, doesn't like to talk about what happened at Kent State, but as commanding officer holds himself responsible for the actions of his men 20 years ago.
The reason I talk at all is that somebody has to tell the guard side. And I take that responsibility as having been the commander. I guess that's my job.
20 years after the shootings, the controversy surrounding Kent State continues. Perhaps it will take another generation for society to objectively look at what happened here and pass judgment for generations to come.
We've had bloodshed. It's a terrible thing that's happened here today. This campus will never forget it. But don't start chasing across...